Welcome to Veil of Epochs, where we uncover the hidden truths beneath history's surface. Today, we journey into the strange world of medieval hygiene, or rather, the deliberate absence of it, a time when bathing wasn't a simple act of cleanliness, but a complex ritual entwined with fear, faith, and social control, where water could weaken the body and soul, and dirt was often considered a shield of virtue. In this episode, we explore why bathing was seen not as a necessity, but as a sin. Why some of the holiest men went decades without washing, earning reverence for their uncleanliness. We will uncover the beliefs, customs, and fears that shaped a world where being dirty was, paradoxically, holy. Prepare yourself to see medieval life through a new lens. A world where the Veil of Epochs hides truths stranger than fiction. Let me take you back to a time when smelling like a wet goat was considered a mark of spiritual discipline. Where washing your body was not a sign of cleanliness, but a moral failing. A time when saints were venerated not for their glowing skin, but for their rotting clothes that hadn't been changed in decades. Yes, welcome to the Middle Ages, where bathing was not only discouraged, it was feared. It's hard for us, 21st century creatures of hot showers and strawberry shampoo, to imagine a world where hygiene was a heresy. But if you lived in Europe between the 5th and 15th centuries, the act of bathing could literally land you on the moral blacklist, maybe even branded as unholy. This is not a joke, not satire, not even exaggeration. There were monks who didn't bathe for 30 or 40 years and were canonized as saints. There were bishops who preached that bathing awakened sinful desires. There were kings and queens who might only bathe once or twice a year, on special occasions, if they were feeling particularly luxurious. But why? Why did an entire civilization turn against soap and water? Was it because of a lack of plumbing? Or was it something deeper, something rooted in the very soul of medieval thought? A fear of the body? Of desire? Of decay? Or perhaps of the devil himself? In this video, we're going to peel back the sweaty, crusty, unwashed layers of this curious moment in history. From the steaming public bathhouses of ancient Rome to the cold stone monasteries of Christian Europe. From the so-called stench of sin to the holy aroma of righteous filth, we'll explore how bathing went from a daily routine to an act of spiritual danger. And maybe, just maybe, we'll come to appreciate our soap a little more, because as it turns out, cleanliness might be next to godliness today. But in the Middle Ages, it was a one-way ticket to hell. In the ancient world, water was not just life, it was luxury, sophistication, and civilization itself. The Roman Empire, that towering monument to order and excess, was built on clean aqueducts, public fountains, and bathing rituals so advanced they make modern plumbing look rustic. Across the empire, massive public bathhouses, termi, stood as symbols of imperial power and civic pride. They weren't just places to wash, they were cultural institutions. Inside, there were hot baths, caldarium, cold baths, frigidarium, saunas, steam rooms, massage parlors, libraries, gardens, lecture halls, and even snack counters. You could walk in filthy and leave with your hair oiled, your muscles relaxed, your skin scraped clean with a strigil, and your gossip updated. This infrastructure was astonishing. Aqueducts brought water from the hills for miles. Complex heating systems warmed floors and rooms from below. Wastewater was drained out by underground sewers. To be a Roman was to live clean, not just in body, but in image, in identity. But then, it all collapsed. When the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, the cracks weren't just political. The aqueducts crumbled, roads fell into disrepair, the massive bath complexes, once cleaned and tended daily by slaves and municipal workers, became ghostly ruins. The expertise needed to build and maintain them vanished with the engineers. Cities shrank, populations dispersed, Clean water was no longer a right, it became a luxury. And soon, a memory. And at the same time, a new worldview emerged, one that didn't just tolerate dirt, but embraced it. Enter the church. The early Christian fathers inherited a world obsessed with the physical, and they were deeply suspicious of it. To them, the body was a prison, a trap, something to be denied, not indulged. In their view, Roman baths were more than impractical, they were symbols of pride, temptation, and sin. Bathing, they argued, was vanity. Worse, it stirred the senses, encouraged lust, distracted from prayer. Even nudity, so casually accepted in Roman art and public life, was now seen as a shameful echo of Eden's fall. Washing the body, in this logic, became a spiritual danger. Saint Jerome, who spent years living in ascetic retreat, wrote, "He who has bathed in Christ has no need to bathe in water." The metaphor was deliberate, literal cleanliness was replaced by symbolic purity. And that shift wasn't just theological. It bled into everyday practice. By the 6th century, monastic life was spreading across Europe. And with it came an extreme commitment to poverty, chastity, and, crucially, filth. Monks lived in isolation. They slept on hard floors. They wore coarse robes. They ate bland food. And many of them proudly went unwashed for years. The more you suffered, the holier you were. This wasn't just self-denial. It became heroic. In the Christian imagination of the time, saints were people who transcended the body. And many of them did so in spectacularly smelly ways. Saint Simeon Stylites famously lived atop a stone pillar for nearly 4 decades. He never bathed, never changed his clothes, and never came down. His body rotted in the sun. His skin cracked. Maggots reportedly infested his legs. And yet he was revered. People traveled from distant lands to seek his blessing, his advice, even a relic of his unwashed garments. His dirt was his holiness. Other saints followed suit. Saint Agnes, Saint Catherine of Siena, Saint Benedict Joseph Labra, all were praised for their refusal to clean themselves, their homes, or even touch water unless it was for sacrament. These acts were not seen as odd, they were viewed as divine resistance against temptation. And they set a tone for the entire medieval period. In monastic rules like the rule of Saint Benedict, bathing was allowed only rarely, and only for illness or religious holidays. Monks could go entire years, sometimes lifetimes, without washing. Outside the monasteries, the trend spread. Nobles bathed a few times a year at best. Sometimes in perfumed water but more often in cold basins. Peasants rarely bathed at all, relying instead on scraping off sweat with cloth or rubbing themselves with herbs. To many, water wasn't healing, it was suspicious. By the High Middle Ages, strange theories began to emerge. Some believed water opened the pores and let disease in. Others thought bathing caused the body to weaken spiritually. More still believed that demons could attach to the body more easily after washing. This wasn't universal. In some regions, especially Muslim-controlled Spain, bathing culture remained strong. But across much of Christian Europe, especially the north, being dirty was no longer an unfortunate fact. It was a moral statement. To smell bad was to be good. To itch was to be saved. To suffer the stench of your own body was to carry a cross of the flesh. Bathing had become not just unfashionable, it had become dangerous to your soul. In medieval Europe, the concept of cleanliness was vastly different from what we understand today. Bathing, which for us is a daily or weekly routine, was often regarded with suspicion, fear, or even disdain. This was not because medieval people were ignorant or lazy but because their worldview, shaped by a complex mixture of medical theories, religious beliefs, and social customs, led them to believe that washing the body too frequently could cause more harm than good. Central to medieval medical thought was the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. This idea, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and refined by Roman and early medieval scholars, suggested that the balance of these bodily fluids determined a person's health. Bathing, especially in cold or even lukewarm water, was feared to disrupt this delicate balance by opening the skin's pores, allowing harmful elements, whether invisible miasmas or malevolent spirits, to invade the body. These miasmas were thought to be the source of many diseases, including the terrifying plagues that swept through Europe. Thus, water, paradoxically, was seen as a dangerous conduit for illness rather than a cure. The Church played a significant role in reinforcing these ideas. Spiritual cleanliness was emphasized far more than physical cleanliness. Modesty was a prized virtue, and exposure of the body was often linked with sin and temptation. Public bathhouses, common during the Roman Empire, were increasingly viewed with suspicion by church authorities, as they were associated with immoral behavior, promiscuity, and the spread of disease. This led to many bathhouses closing or being destroyed by religious zealots. Despite the decline of public baths, medieval people did not completely neglect hygiene. Instead, they developed alternative ways to cope with bodily odors and the general grime of everyday life. Since regular washing was rare, the changing of clothes became the primary method of maintaining a sense of cleanliness. People wore linen undergarments that could be washed more often, and outer garments might be brushed or aired out. The wealthier classes could afford to change clothes frequently, but for peasants, even this was a luxury. To mask unpleasant smells, herbs and flowers played an essential role. Bundles of rosemary, lavender, mint, and sage were carried around or hung in homes to perfume the air and repel insects. People also used pomanders, small containers filled with fragrant substances, to hold pleasant aromas close to their noses. These scents were believed not only to please the senses but also to protect against disease and evil spirits. It was common to see medieval markets selling bunches of aromatic herbs and even medicinal plants designed to purify the air. Accounts from the period tell us that body odor was an accepted part of life. People did not find the smell of sweat or dirt repulsive in the way modern society does. This acceptance extended to social situations. For instance, visitors to a noble's castle or a wealthy merchant's home would expect to encounter the mingling scents of animals, food, and unwashed bodies, all blended into the atmosphere. The concept of personal space and scent was very different. Interestingly, even monarchs adhered to these hygiene customs. King Louis IX of France was reportedly so devoted to his religious principles that he bathed only a few times in his entire life, considering frequent bathing a vain indulgence. Queen Elizabeth I of England was known to bathe no more than once a month, a practice she considered sufficient for cleanliness and proper modesty. These royal examples reinforced social norms across all classes. Medical texts from the period, such as the works of Hildegard of Bingen and Avicenna, advised against frequent bathing, warning that it weakened the body's defenses. Instead, they recommended dry cleaning methods like rubbing the skin with cloths, applying scented oils, or using powders made from flowers or herbs. Such treatments were believed to strengthen the skin and prevent illness by keeping the humors in balance. The fear of water and bathing was not uniform across Europe. However, in Mediterranean regions and Islamic territories, bathing remained more prevalent. Hammams, or public bathhouses, were important social and religious centers where people gathered not only to cleanse their bodies but also to socialize and relax. These bathhouses emphasized ritual purity and community bonding and continued to flourish despite occasional religious criticisms. In Northern Europe, though, the Black Death in the 14th century reinforced negative views of bathing. The plague killed millions and was thought to spread through water and open pores. People avoided bathing out of terror, believing it was safer to stay dry and avoid contact with contaminated water. This period marked the nadir of bathing customs in Europe. When dirt and grime were common companions of daily life, living without bathing meant medieval people had to tolerate lice, fleas, and other parasites. These pests were a persistent part of life, causing discomfort and spreading disease. Yet people adapted by wearing layered clothing and covering themselves with fragrances and powders to lessen the impact. Personal cleanliness was largely measured by the cleanliness of one's clothes rather than one's skin. The architecture of medieval homes also reflected these attitudes. Most houses lacked plumbing or drainage systems, so clean running water was a rarity. People collected water from wells, rivers, or communal fountains for drinking and cooking, but avoided using it for washing their bodies. In castles and manor houses, there were sometimes rudimentary bathing facilities, but these were infrequently used and often more for ceremonial purposes than for hygiene. Thus, medieval Europeans lived in a world where the boundaries between dirt, health, and morality were blurred. The lack of regular bathing was not simply a matter of ignorance but a complex adaptation to the medical knowledge, religious doctrine, and social realities of the time. To us, it might seem revolting, but for them, it was a way of life, a delicate balance between physical survival and spiritual salvation. In the 14th century, when Europe was gripped by the devastating Black Death, fear and superstition around cleanliness and disease reached a fever pitch. It is said that some of the most devout Christians refused to bathe for years on end, believing that washing would wash away their souls or open their bodies to evil spirits. One famous figure was Saint Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, a revered monk who reportedly did not bathe for 40 years. Despite this, or perhaps because of his austere devotion, he was canonized and celebrated as a holy man. His extreme avoidance of bathing was seen as a mark of spiritual strength, not neglect. Stories like Saint Cuthbert's were not uncommon in monastic circles. Many monks and nuns practiced severe asceticism, rejecting bodily pleasures to focus on the purity of the soul. For them, the body was a vessel of temptation and sin, so bathing was often viewed as a dangerous indulgence that could weaken their spiritual resolve. The monastic routines involved fasting, prayer, and hard labor, all designed to discipline the body. But rarely did they include washing in water. For the common folk, the experience was much more earthy and pragmatic. Life was hard, and dirt was a part of daily existence. Peasants working in fields from dawn till dusk rarely had the luxury to wash regularly. Children would play in muddy streets and rivers, but full body washing was a rarity. Many people made do with wiping their faces and hands with cloths and changing their linen garments when possible. Yet, despite the lack of bathing, personal odor was not necessarily a source of shame in medieval society. In fact, the smells of daily life, sweat, wood smoke, cooking fires, animals, and even human waste, mingled freely in the air. This olfactory environment was normal and expected. Visitors to medieval fairs or markets would not have been shocked by the scents, rather, they accepted them as part of the human condition. The medieval nobility also embraced this lifestyle, but with certain refinements. The wealthy could afford perfumed gloves, scented handkerchiefs, and costly oils imported from the East. Queen Elizabeth I was famous for her elaborate perfumes and cosmetics, masking her natural scent but bathing infrequently. Royal courts were places of constant fragrance, where flowers, incense, and aromatic herbs filled the air. Yet even the most elegant monarchs did not bathe regularly. Their hygiene was maintained through layers of fine clothing and powders. Medical practitioners reinforced these customs through their teachings. The writings of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess and healer, warned against bathing in cold water and advised using dry cleaning methods like rubbing the skin with cloth and applying herbal powders. Avicenna, the Persian polymath whose works were widely read in Europe, also cautioned that bathing could weaken the body's natural defenses. On the architectural side, the design of homes reflected these hygiene habits. Most medieval houses had no running water or indoor plumbing. People relied on wells and communal water sources that were often miles away. Bathing in rivers or streams was common but usually seasonal and limited by weather. Castles might have stone basins or wooden tubs, but these were rarely filled with warm water and used only for ceremonial cleansing or healing rituals. The fear of bathing was so ingrained that it persisted for centuries, even when public bathhouses flourished briefly during the Renaissance. They were often associated with vice and disease. Religious authorities condemned them as places of temptation and moral decay, leading to their decline. Understanding these attitudes helps us grasp how medieval people lived with dirt and odor as normal parts of life. Their ideas about cleanliness were shaped by the limits of their science, their spiritual beliefs, and the harsh realities of daily survival. Far from being simply filthy or backward, their approach was a complex adaptation to their world, one where the soul's purity mattered far more than the body's cleanliness. In the 14th century, when Europe was gripped by the devastating Black Death, fear and superstition around cleanliness and disease reached a fever pitch. It is said that some of the most devout Christians refused to bathe for years on end, believing that washing would wash away their souls or open their bodies to evil spirits. One famous figure was Saint Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, a revered monk who reportedly did not bathe for 40 years. Despite this, or perhaps because of his austere devotion, he was canonized and celebrated as a holy man. His extreme avoidance of bathing was seen as a mark of spiritual strength, not neglect. Stories like Saint Cuthbert's were not uncommon in monastic circles. Many monks and nuns practiced severe asceticism, rejecting bodily pleasures to focus on the purity of the soul. For them, the body was a vessel of temptation and sin, so bathing was often viewed as a dangerous indulgence that could weaken their spiritual resolve. The monastic routines involved fasting, prayer, and hard labor, all designed to discipline the body. But rarely did they include washing in water. For the common folk, the experience was much more earthy and pragmatic. Life was hard, and dirt was a part of daily existence. Peasants working in fields from dawn till dusk rarely had the luxury to wash regularly. Children would play in muddy streets and rivers, but full body washing was a rarity. Many people made do with wiping their faces and hands with cloths and changing their linen garments when possible. Yet, despite the lack of bathing, personal odor was not necessarily a source of shame in medieval society. In fact, the smells of daily life, sweat, wood smoke, cooking fires, animals, and even human waste, mingled freely in the air. This olfactory environment was normal and expected. Visitors to medieval fairs or markets would not have been shocked by the scents, rather, they accepted them as part of the human condition. The medieval nobility also embraced this lifestyle, but with certain refinements. The wealthy could afford perfumed gloves, scented handkerchiefs, and costly oils imported from the East. Queen Elizabeth I was famous for her elaborate perfumes and cosmetics, masking her natural scent but bathing infrequently. Royal courts were places of constant fragrance, where flowers, incense, and aromatic herbs filled the air. Yet even the most elegant monarchs did not bathe regularly. Their hygiene was maintained through layers of fine clothing and powders. Medical practitioners reinforced these customs through their teachings. The writings of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess and healer, warned against bathing in cold water and advised using dry cleaning methods like rubbing the skin with cloth and applying herbal powders. Avicenna, the Persian polymath whose works were widely read in Europe, also cautioned that bathing could weaken the body's natural defenses. On the architectural side, the design of homes reflected these hygiene habits. Most medieval houses had no running water or indoor plumbing. People relied on wells and communal water sources that were often miles away. Bathing in rivers or streams was common but usually seasonal and limited by weather. Castles might have stone basins or wooden tubs, but these were rarely filled with warm water and used only for ceremonial cleansing or healing rituals. The fear of bathing was so ingrained that it persisted for centuries. Even when public bathhouses flourished briefly during the Renaissance, they were often associated with vice and disease. Religious authorities condemned them as places of temptation and moral decay, leading to their decline. Understanding these attitudes helps us grasp how medieval people lived with dirt and odor as normal parts of life. Their ideas about cleanliness were shaped by the limits of their science, their spiritual beliefs, and the harsh realities of daily survival. Far from being simply filthy or backward, their approach was a complex adaptation to their world, one where the soul's purity mattered far more than the body's cleanliness. Despite what might seem strange to us today, medieval people genuinely believed that abstaining from bathing was a form of spiritual discipline and moral strength. The idea of cleanliness was not aligned with modern hygiene, but rather with religious purity and humility. Public bathhouses, which once thrived in the early Middle Ages, began to decline sharply by the 13th and 14th centuries, partly because they became associated with sin, lust, and disease. Authorities, especially the church, started viewing these places as hubs of moral corruption. This fear was not entirely unfounded. Many bathhouses were communal and cramped, often lacking proper sanitation. Rumors spread that these bathhouses were breeding grounds for disease, a fear later exacerbated by the outbreak of the Black Death. Medieval people believed that exposing their bodies to water or heat could weaken their spirits, making them vulnerable to demonic influence or illness. The paradox was that avoiding bathing was thought to strengthen the soul and body against the perils of the world. Take the case of a 13th century French monk, Saint Anthony of Padua, who was famously said to have not bathed for decades. He was regarded as a holy man, a symbol of piety and asceticism. For him, and many others, renouncing bathing was part of rejecting worldly vanity and pleasures. This ascetic lifestyle was praised as a pathway to divine favor. It was a visible sign of devotion to God, rejecting the temptations of physical comfort. Imagine how the daily life of an average medieval peasant or noble looked like in this context. The air in villages was often thick with the smell of smoke, cooking fires, and animals. People wore heavy woolen clothes that didn't wash often, and personal cleanliness was sacrificed for practicality and belief. Body odors, lice infestations, and grimy skin were common but accepted as part of life. To many, these were marks of endurance, resilience, and even holiness. Communities often relied on the ritual of sprinkling holy water or fragrant herbs to mask odors rather than regular washing. Soap was rare and expensive, and water sources could be contaminated. Bathing might have happened only on special religious occasions or during particular seasons. But even then, it was a cautious and ritualized act rather than a hygienic routine. However, the avoidance of bathing was not absolute. Some people still washed their hands, faces, or feet daily, following religious customs such as ablutions before prayer. But full-body bathing was often avoided due to the widespread belief that it could open the pores and let harmful spirits enter the body. As centuries passed, the cultural stigma around bathing continued to grow stronger, influenced heavily by the church's teachings and the lived realities of medieval life. Yet, this widespread avoidance of bathing did not mean that medieval people were completely indifferent to personal care. Instead, they adapted other methods of maintaining a sense of cleanliness within the confines of their beliefs and limited resources. Dry bathing, or the practice of rubbing the body with cloths and powders, became a common alternative. People used mixtures of herbs, oils, and scented powders made from flowers such as lavender and rosemary to mask unpleasant odors. These fragrances were prized not only for their pleasant smell but also for their supposed ability to ward off disease and evil spirits. For the medieval mind, smell was closely linked to health and morality. A foul odor could be interpreted as a sign of sin or moral corruption. In wealthier households, the elite nobility indulged in more frequent hand and face washing using scented waters and perfumed oils imported from the East. Their castles often featured rudimentary plumbing and private wash basins, allowing for some semblance of cleanliness. Lavish banquets would be accompanied by attendants holding scented gloves and cloths to freshen the guests, emphasizing the importance of outward appearances even when bathing was rare. The architecture of medieval castles and manors reflected this reality. Water was a precious resource, and sophisticated plumbing was largely unknown or impractical. Stone sinks and basins, known as lavabos, were used mainly by the clergy during religious rites rather than for personal hygiene. Bathrooms as we know them today were virtually non-existent. Instead, chamber pots and waste disposal systems were rudimentary and often unsanitary. In rural villages, access to clean water was limited. People relied on wells, rivers, and rainwater collection, which were shared communally and often contaminated. During colder months, bathing was almost impossible without risking hypothermia. Illnesses such as skin infections, scabies, and parasites were common but accepted as part of daily life. Folk remedies and herbal medicines were widely used to alleviate these conditions, often with little scientific basis but deep cultural significance. Religious festivals and pilgrimages sometimes provided opportunities for communal washing, considered acts of spiritual cleansing. Holy springs and rivers were destinations for those seeking healing or divine forgiveness. However, these were exceptional occasions rather than regular practices. The persistence of these hygiene habits reveals much about medieval society's relationship with the body, sin, and health. The human body was viewed not as a temple to be kept pristine but as a vessel burdened by original sin and mortal weakness. Excessive concern for physical cleanliness was seen as vanity and a distraction from spiritual growth. Despite these beliefs, the medieval period was not entirely devoid of hygiene practices. Nobility and clergy had access to perfumes, bathing in warm water when possible, and used elaborate grooming rituals. The common folk, however, adapted to their harsher conditions with pragmatic and symbolic forms of cleanliness. This paradox between spiritual purity and physical dirtiness shaped the era's social fabric, influencing everything from fashion to social etiquette. It also laid the groundwork for centuries of misunderstanding about cleanliness, health, and the human body that would only be overturned with the advances of the Renaissance and later scientific discoveries. Besides using perfumes and herbal powders for dry bathing, medieval people also paid great attention to cleaning their clothes and cloaks, items considered closest to the body. Clothes were washed regularly, even though the process was laborious and time-consuming, especially for common folk. Laundry was not only about cleanliness but also about showing respect for oneself and society. Those who neglected their clothing were often seen as lazy or uncivilized. In monasteries, monks had strict rules about cleanliness, not only of their bodies but also of their surroundings. They regularly cleaned their living quarters, dining areas, and monastery grounds as a form of spiritual and physical discipline. In many places, monasteries were centers preserving knowledge about medicine, herbs, and hygiene techniques of the time. The daily life of common people was closely tied to nature and the agricultural cycle, which influenced their hygiene habits. The cold winters made bathing in water extremely difficult. Many had to endure body odor and skin problems for months. They coped by wearing multiple layers of clothing and thick blankets, while using natural scents to mask body odors. Avoiding bathing was also partly linked to the medical beliefs of the time. as traditional doctors believed that hot baths weakened the body and made one susceptible to illness. Conversely, keeping the body dry and avoiding sudden temperature changes was thought to strengthen the immune system. These ideas reinforced people's reluctance to bathe and their preference to maintain cleanliness in alternative ways. Religious holidays and traditional rituals were occasions to perform symbolic purification acts, such as washing hands, faces, or soaking feet in herbal water. However, these were not full-body baths but spiritual practices meant to renew the soul. From a social perspective, the avoidance of bathing created new standards of beauty and attractiveness. Artificial fragrances became the norm, and wealthy, noble people invested heavily in perfumes and herbal cosmetics to mask ordinary smells. The poor accepted living with body odor as a part of life. However, this also had significant public health consequences. Epidemics, skin infections, and contagious diseases spread unchecked. Many areas became isolated or even abandoned due to foul smells and disease. Thus, we see a paradox. The emphasis on virtue and spiritual purification led medieval people to sacrifice physical health, creating a society with very different notions of cleanliness and what it meant to be clean. In medieval Europe, the concept of cleanliness extended far beyond the physical. It was deeply intertwined with spirituality, morality, and social order. People believed that the body and soul were connected, so purifying the soul often took precedence over cleansing the flesh. Bathing, surprisingly to modern sensibilities, was often viewed with suspicion or even fear. It was thought that excessive washing could weaken the body's natural defenses and open the door to evil spirits or disease. This belief was especially strong during the Middle Ages, when epidemics and plagues ravaged communities with little medical understanding to combat them. Hygiene practices were minimal compared to today's standards. People might wash their faces and hands, and children often played in streams. But full-body bathing was rare. Instead, daily routines focused on dry cleaning, rubbing the skin with cloths, changing linen undergarments frequently, and using perfumes or scented oils to mask odors. These practices were seen as sufficient to maintain a respectful appearance and social acceptance. The social implications of bathing, or the lack thereof, were significant. Nobles and clergy had access to bathhouses and private baths within castles or monasteries. However, even among the elite, bathing was more of a ritual or occasional luxury than a daily habit. Public bathhouses, common in earlier Roman times, had largely fallen out of favor, often associated with moral laxity or disease transmission. For common folk, bathing facilities were almost non-existent. They relied on communal rivers, ponds, or rainwater to wash their hands or clothes, but not themselves thoroughly. The stench of body odor and unwashed garments was a fact of life in crowded villages. Yet, despite this, medieval people lived vibrant social lives. Markets, festivals, religious ceremonies, and communal meals all thrived, with personal hygiene taking a backseat to survival and community cohesion. Interestingly, some religious figures took the idea of holy dirtiness to extremes. Certain ascetics and monks practiced extreme forms of austerity, avoiding bathing for years, even decades, as a sign of humility and spiritual discipline. One famous figure, Saint Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, reportedly did not bathe for 40 years and was nonetheless venerated as a saint. Such practices reinforced the belief that the soul's purity mattered far more than the body's cleanliness. For many, the choice to avoid bathing was not simply superstition but a way to assert identity and devotion in a world often harsh and unpredictable. Bathing was a potential threat to the fragile balance between health, spiritual well-being, and social order. The fear of waterborne diseases or evil spirits created a culture where being clean could be seen as dangerous or sinful. Despite the general aversion to bathing, Water still played a role in the lives of medieval people, but it was often symbolic, ceremonial, or utilitarian. In Christian doctrine, water was sacred, used in baptisms to cleanse the soul, not the body. Infants were sprinkled with holy water to welcome them into the faith. And during Mass, water was used to bless congregants. Ironically, while the Church discouraged regular bathing, it fully embraced water in religious contexts. The contradiction wasn't lost on the people of the time. Many believed that spiritual cleanliness could protect them from physical ailments. Prayers, penance, and confessions were thought to be more effective at warding off disease than soap or hot water. Illness was often seen as divine punishment rather than a result of poor hygiene. This perception was so deeply rooted that even when epidemics struck, such as the Black Death, communities turned to fasting and flagellation, not washing, as remedies. Life without regular bathing had its own consequences. Of course, skin diseases, lice infestations, and foul odors were widespread. Medieval physicians, relying on Galenic theories of the four humours, sometimes recommended not bathing, as they believed it could upset the balance of bodily fluids. They claimed warm water opened the pores, allowing dangerous miasmas, bad air, to enter the body, which could lead to fever, madness, or worse. Despite the risk of disease, society adapted. Clothing, particularly linen undergarments, became a substitute for skin cleanliness. People of means changed their underclothes frequently, believing that fresh fabric absorbed bodily impurities. Lavender, rosemary, and rose water were used to scent the garments or rooms, giving an illusion of freshness even when the body remained untouched by water. Among the aristocracy, scented gloves, powdered wigs, and perfumed pouches were popular. A nobleman or lady could go weeks without a proper bath but still appear and smell refined, at least by contemporary standards. Cosmetics and powders helped mask blemishes and odor. And for those who could afford it, bathhouses attached to castles or private residences provided rare but luxurious opportunities to soak in herbal water. However, for the peasantry, life was different. Most lived in single-room homes shared with animals, with limited access to clean water. When washing did occur, it was often communal. Families might bathe together in a wooden tub filled with boiled water, starting with the head of the household and ending with the youngest child. The water, by then murky and tepid, was still precious and reused as needed. Odors were so common that they simply faded into the background. The strong smell of manure in rural villages, mixed with smoke from hearth fires and the constant presence of unwashed bodies, created a sensory environment modern noses would find unbearable. But medieval people adapted to it, and perhaps never knew a life that smelled different. Even the concept of bad smell was culturally relative. What we now consider foul could have been neutral, or even comforting, in a society that equated body scent with authenticity, labor, or even holiness. A shepherd's odor might be a mark of hard work, a monk's unwashed robe, a badge of spiritual endurance. In many ways, the absence of bathing was a shared reality, a social equalizer, whether in a noble court or a peasant village. The daily struggle was not for freshness but for survival, salvation, and status. And in that world, cleanliness was not next to godliness, it was, more often, its opposite. As the Middle Ages wore on, certain cities across Europe began to experiment with public bathhouses, borrowing inspiration from the Roman termae. Places like Paris, London, and Prague had communal bathhouses that, for a brief period, became popular among both nobility and townsfolk. These facilities offered hot water, steam rooms, and occasionally even food and entertainment, creating an odd fusion between hygiene and social gathering. However, this renewed interest in bathing came at a dangerous price. Public bathhouses quickly gained a reputation, not just for health, but for vice. It wasn't long before the church condemned many of them as dens of sin and temptation. Because the bathhouses were often mixed gender and lacking in modesty, they became closely associated with prostitution, gossip, and indulgence. By the 14th and 15th centuries, a once promising revival of public cleanliness was gradually crushed beneath a tide of moral condemnation and fear. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe beginning in 1347, accelerated this decline. As the death toll rose, suspicions also grew. Doctors and priests warned that opening the skin's pores through warm water made individuals more vulnerable to the plague's deadly miasmas. This belief once again drove people away from bathing. Municipal bathhouses were closed down or fell into disrepair. Personal hygiene was reduced to rubbing oneself with linen cloth, changing undergarments, or applying powders and scented oils. Bathing became something one only did under extreme circumstances, such as before marriage, during severe illness, or in ritual contexts like Holy Week. But even these rare occasions were approached with caution. Medieval manuals and moral treatises warned against vanity and the sins of the flesh. A woman who took too much care in washing her hair or perfuming her body might be seen as immodest or even inviting temptation. Men, likewise, were cautioned against spending too much time grooming themselves lest they be accused of effeminacy or sloth. One of the most curious manifestations of this anti-bathing culture was the emergence of holy filth as a spiritual ideal. Saints and mystics proudly recorded the number of years they had abstained from bathing or changing clothes. Saint Agnes of Rome, it was said, never washed her body in water but only in her tears. Saint Thomas of Villanova wore the same tunic for 17 years. And perhaps most famously, Saint Benedict Joseph Labra lived in squalor and filth, considering it a sign of humility and detachment from worldly vanity. In such a world, dirt became synonymous with devotion. The stink of a holy person was not something to be ridiculed, but revered. It was a sign that they had transcended bodily desires and were focused only on the soul's salvation. For the ordinary peasant, of course, there was little choice. Clean water was scarce. Soap, made from animal fat and ash, was expensive or time-consuming to produce. And time spent bathing was time not spent farming, weaving, cooking, or surviving. The laboring classes lived lives so physically demanding that the idea of a leisurely bath was more fantasy than routine. Even in castles, the experience was far from luxurious. A noble might bathe in a barrel or wooden tub once a season, surrounded by servants pouring buckets of warmed water and scented herbs, but the water was often reused, and the privacy minimal. Lice, fleas, and rashes were common nuisances even among kings. Take, for example, Louis XIV of France, the famed Sun King of the 17th century, who reportedly bathed only twice in his entire life. He preferred perfume over water and kept his courtrooms scented with flowers and incense to mask the natural stench of unwashed bodies. The image of glittering Versailles was, in truth, draped in layers of sweat, powder, and perfume. This ideology, where physical filth was equated with spiritual purity, was not merely tolerated, but systematized. Monasteries, the intellectual and spiritual hubs of the Middle Ages, often enforced rules discouraging regular washing. Some monastic orders went so far as to ban bathing entirely except in cases of life-threatening illness. Cleanliness of the soul, they claimed, far outweighed cleanliness of the flesh. The mortal body was a vessel, temporary and corrupt, destined to decay. Why care for a shell when eternity waited? This contempt for bathing extended into religious art and literature. Saints were portrayed in tattered robes, surrounded by vermin, glorified for their endurance of physical squalor. Pilgrims traveling to holy shrines like Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela wore their dust and sweat like badges of honor. A well-worn, stinking tunic proved one's commitment to God more convincingly than any polished garment ever could. But while saints and ascetics were idolized for their stench, this same odor on the common folk became a subject of ridicule, or worse, suspicion. Smell became politicized. To be too clean was to be vain or sinful, to be too filthy, unless justified by holiness, was to risk being labeled a beggar, a witch, or a leper. Medieval society was obsessed with classification: who smelled from poverty, who from piety, and who from pestilence. Ironically, despite the religious exaltation of dirt, the fear of disease remained potent. The contradiction was never truly resolved. On one hand, clerics preached the dangers of bodily indulgence through bathing. On the other, plagues ravaged cities, and filth was clearly associated with contagion. But rather than revisit the practice of washing, most communities doubled down on spiritual solutions: more prayers, more relics, more processions. In many cities, officials would order public processions in which entire populations marched barefoot, whipped themselves, and prayed for deliverance from disease, while still avoiding basic hygiene. Disease, they believed, was divine punishment for sin, not poor sanitation. The cure was repentance, not rinsing. And so the paradox deepened. The noblest of men could die of lice-infested wounds while being praised for their holy neglect of the flesh. Villagers would flee from neighbors not because they were unclean, but because they were thought to be cursed or possessed. The smell of sanctity and the stench of suspicion grew indistinguishable. This dissonance found its way into the writings of the time. Medieval medical texts warned of excessive bathing, claiming it weakened the organs, softened the brain, and opened the body to evil humors. In fact, physicians often prescribed avoiding water entirely during illness. Instead, patients were instructed to dry scrub their skin, inhale perfumes, or wrap themselves in linen soaked with vinegar. Even when bathing was unavoidable, it was ritualized to remove any sense of luxury. Pilgrims might wash only in holy springs or on religious feast days. Women preparing for marriage were sometimes bathed by elder relatives with prayers muttered over the water, turning the act into a spiritual cleansing rather than a hygienic one. The water itself might be blessed, mixed with herbs said to drive out demons, not dirt. And perhaps most tragically, this aversion to bathing shaped not just daily life, but death as well. Corpses were rarely washed. The ritual of preparing the dead involved shrouding them quickly, sometimes with perfumed cloths to mask decomposition. Funeral rites focused on the soul's journey rather than the state of the body. Physical decay was expected, almost celebrated, as a reminder of mortality and the impermanence of flesh. Yet as the late Middle Ages unfolded, the stench of holiness began to lose its sanctity. Europe's cities, growing denser and more populous, became breeding grounds for disease. The Black Death of the 14th century was a turning point, an event so catastrophic that it cracked open the medieval worldview. The plague, which wiped out nearly half of Europe's population, didn't seem to care how pious one was. Saints and sinners alike dropped dead in the streets. No amount of prayer, relics, or barefoot processions could stop it. And slowly, a question began to emerge: could filth, rather than sin, be the true culprit? In the aftermath, city leaders and doctors, still deeply religious, started pushing for changes that once would have been seen as scandalously indulgent. Public bathhouses, though still controversial, began to reappear in some urban centers, though many were also used as brothels, and thus frowned upon by the church. They nonetheless reflected a shifting mindset: cleanliness might have a role in health after all. Doctors started to observe patterns. Areas with cleaner water had fewer outbreaks. People who washed more frequently seemed to recover better from wounds. The church, stubborn but not blind, began to allow exceptions, especially for monks who treated the sick. A Dominican friar, for example, might be granted permission to bathe monthly if he worked in a leper hospital. And in private, the nobility began to bathe more often, though still secretly. Some castles had rudimentary bath chambers, where wooden tubs were lined with linen, and servants poured heated water over their lords and ladies. Herbal infusions were added, rosemary, lavender, mint, not only for fragrance, but also to balance the humors according to Galenic medicine. It was not yet science, but it was a shift. Still, the average peasant lived much as before, fearful of water, fearful of illness, fearful of damnation. Rivers were for drinking and waste. The idea of stepping into one for cleansing was both impractical and spiritually risky. Yet even among the peasantry, change was bubbling. The emerging merchant class, people who traveled between cities and across borders, brought new ideas. They saw Roman ruins with sophisticated aqueducts and bath complexes. They heard tales from Muslim lands, where daily bathing was common, even expected. The contrast was staggering. In places like Cordoba or Baghdad, soap was perfumed and hygiene was tied to both faith and medicine. To medieval Europeans, these were exotic lands. But the ideas they carried began to seep into Western thought. Writers and philosophers, no longer all bound to ecclesiastical dogma, began to criticize the old views. Petrarch, a 14th century humanist, lamented the decay of both body and mind under the church's shadow. He praised Roman hygiene, mocked the filth of his contemporaries, and called for a return to clarity of thought and of skin. Even literature changed. Instead of saints swallowing in dirt, new characters emerged: courtly lovers, fastidious nobles, clever merchants, who valued perfume, clean hands, and fresh linen. Bathing became a sign not of decadence, but of refinement. Slowly, and unevenly, the cultural tide began to turn. But the shift was neither smooth nor total. In many rural areas, especially in Northern Europe, the fear of bathing lingered for centuries. Superstitions ran deep. Children were still baptized but not scrubbed. Old women warned that water on the skin could let the cold in or loosen the soul. Even in cities, public bathhouses were often targets of suspicion. Priests warned that Satan lurked in steam. Rumors spread of women being seduced or even possessed while bathing. And yet, the bathhouses persisted, torn down by one council, rebuilt by the next. Eventually, the Renaissance brought not just a revival of art and science, but a renaissance of the body. Anatomists dissected cadavers, doctors questioned old texts, and philosophers debated the balance between spirit and flesh. Hygiene, tentative and partial, was on the rise. But the scars of centuries without it remained. As the Renaissance dawned, the world began to smell a little different. The intellectual firestorm that erupted in Italy in the 15th century didn't just ignite art and astronomy, it reached into the bathhouse, the bedroom, and the bloodstream. The rediscovery of ancient Roman and Greek texts brought with them not only philosophical ideals but also practical ones. Roman hygiene, once buried under centuries of Christian suspicion, returned to the European imagination like a revelation from the gods. Suddenly, filth was no longer a virtue but a problem to be solved. Doctors and anatomists, empowered by newly legitimized dissections, began to understand how the human body worked in ways their medieval predecessors never could. While they still believed in humors and miasma, bad air, their observations forced them to reconsider old beliefs. Andreas Vesalius, the great Flemish anatomist, mapped the body with precision. Ambroise Paré redefined surgical practice. And behind their work was a growing understanding: cleanliness had medical value. It wasn't just theory. Royal courts across Europe began to embrace more elaborate hygiene rituals, blending science with ceremony. Queen Elizabeth I of England, for example, was famously fond of bathing, whether she needed it or not. She was said to bathe once a month, which, by the standards of her time, was practically luxurious. Perfume became political. Clean linens became a marker of status. Silk robes and scented gloves told the world, I am civilized, I am clean, I am powerful. In France, the court of Versailles became infamous not only for its extravagance but for its contradictions. The palace had hundreds of fountains but very few toilets. Guests often relieved themselves behind curtains or on the stairs, and yet, they wore powdered wigs and drenched themselves in cologne. Cleanliness was now aspirational, even if it wasn't always practical. But the shift wasn't limited to nobility. In urban centers, especially in Italy and the Low Countries, the merchant class led a revolution of reason and order. Public bathhouses were regulated, barbers doubled as surgeons, and soap making became a booming industry. In places like Venice and Antwerp, people began washing their hands before meals, not just to avoid demons, but to avoid disease. Soap, once a rare luxury, became increasingly accessible. Made from animal fat and lye, it was often harsh, but effective. In Marseille, a soap industry flourished that still exists today. In Castile, olive oil soap became a staple. These weren't just cleaning products, they were symbols of modernity. The church, too, began to soften its stance. While some clergy still preached ascetic purity, others began to reinterpret scripture. Christ washing the feet of his disciples became a metaphor for cleanliness as humility, not indulgence. Baptism was no longer seen as a one-time spiritual cleansing, but part of a broader Christian ethic of care for the body. Still, resistance remained. In more conservative regions, especially in rural areas, old fears clung on. Too much washing could still be seen as vain, even effeminate. Women who bathed too often were sometimes accused of witchcraft or seduction. But these views were increasingly on the fringe. The printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, accelerated change. Pamphlets spread medical advice. Satirical works mocked the holy stink of earlier saints. Writers like Rabelais and Erasmus took aim at medieval filth with biting humor. In The Praise of Folly, Erasmus wrote, "Some men avoid water so devoutly, you'd think it baptized the devil himself." A new ideal emerged, the well-kept, rational, clean-bodied individual. No longer a temptation to sin. The physical body was something to be studied, maintained, and even celebrated. Renaissance art reflected this too. Michelangelo's David stood not cloaked in sackcloth, but nude, muscles taut, skin smooth, marble almost glowing. This was the opposite of the medieval saint caked in grime. This was beauty reborn. And yet, beneath the skin of the Renaissance man still lurked centuries of superstition. People still feared the night air, still believed that bathing opened the pores to evil vapors. Many still washed infrequently, substituting linen changes and perfume for real hygiene. But the shift had begun. A civilization that once glorified sacred filth was learning to worship something else, the dignity of a clean, rational, visible self. By the 17th century, the idea that dirty is holy had begun to lose its sacred aura, but that didn't mean people were suddenly clean. In fact, much of Europe continued to embrace filth, not out of religious conviction this time, but out of fear. Medical theories still leaned on miasma, the belief that bad smells carried disease. Ironically, this belief didn't push people to wash more. Instead, it pushed them to seal themselves off from air and water entirely. Bathing, it was thought, opened the pores, made the skin vulnerable, and let the bad air seep in. If you bathed too often, you risked inviting death. This gave rise to what some historians now call the Great Stink Era. People, especially the upper classes, began to adopt an armor of perfume, powders, and elaborate clothing designed not to protect the body from dirt, but to hide the smell of it. In Louis XIV's France, the Palace of Versailles had 700 rooms and almost no toilets. Guests relieved themselves in fireplaces, behind curtains, or wherever they pleased. But everyone wore silk. Everyone wore wigs. Everyone was powdered to perfection. Louis XIV himself reportedly bathed only twice in his entire life. Cleanliness became more about image than hygiene. The nobility preferred to change their linen shirts daily, believing the fabric absorbed dirt and sweat. To them, changing clothes was equivalent to bathing. And soap? It was used more for washing gloves and lace than for skin. Meanwhile, perfume reached the height of its cultural power. In the French court, perfumers were held in high esteem, almost like alchemists. They crafted complex fragrances not just to smell good, but to mask rot, civet, musk, and ambergris, all animalic. Pungent substances were used in powerful concoctions that clung to skin, hair, and clothing. To smell strong was to smell rich. But not everyone had access to perfume or silk linens. The working class and peasantry still lived much like their medieval ancestors. In villages, people shared wells, reused water, and rarely changed clothing. Soap, though more available than before, was still expensive. Many made their own using animal fat and ash. But the process was harsh and the result unappealing. Still, signs of change crept in. In the Netherlands, a growing middle class began to prioritize cleanliness, not out of luxury, but out of practicality. Dutch homes became famous for their scrubbed floors, bright windows, and neat courtyards. Paintings by artists like Jan Steen and Peter de Hooch idealized the tidy home, the well-dressed child, and the active domestic order. Here, in these Protestant regions, cleanliness was no longer sinful, it was godly. Women were central to this shift. Housewives took pride in managing the household's hygiene. Girls were taught from a young age to sweep, launder, and wash. Soap-making became a domestic skill passed down through generations. But there was a darker undercurrent to this obsession with order. Cleanliness became a marker of moral character. To be dirty was not just to be poor, it was to be lazy, sinful, even criminal. The poor seen as naturally unclean, and therefore less trustworthy. This fueled a dangerous logic, that cleanliness equals goodness equals superiority. Colonial powers, especially Britain and France, carried this belief into their empires. Indigenous people were deemed savages because of their bathing customs, despite the fact that many non-European cultures bathed far more frequently than Europeans did. The irony was profound. Those who bathed weekly or daily were called barbaric by people who had never touched soap. This moralization of hygiene paved the way for more systemic control. Cities began to implement public health measures, street cleaning, sewage systems, even public bathhouses. But these were often reserved for the urban middle class. The poor, as always, were left behind. And while some elite thinkers, like Voltaire and Benjamin Franklin, began to advocate for regular washing, they were still the exception. Voltaire bathed weekly and was considered eccentric for it. Franklin, visiting Europe from America, famously declared that cleanliness is next to godliness. But he was often ignored. Meanwhile, Europe continued to smell like unwashed wool and rotting meat. Even hospitals were filthy. Surgeons operated with dirty hands, on dirty tables, with no anesthesia and no antiseptics. Death from infection was so common it was considered natural. Doctors wore blood-stained coats as a badge of honor, and the idea of sterilization was centuries away. And yet, even in this grimy world, the seeds of change were being planted. By the 1800s, the world was changing fast. The Industrial Revolution had reshaped cities, economies, and everyday life. People moved from rural villages to crowded cities, and with them came the stench of overpopulation, open sewers, rotting garbage, and disease. For a while, things got worse before they got better. London, once a proud imperial capital, became a cesspool. The River Thames turned into a ribbon of filth. People dumped chamber pots directly into the streets, which sloped conveniently toward the water. The city stank so badly that in 1858, Parliament was forced to suspend its session because members could not bear the smell. The event became known as the Great Stink, and it wasn't just London. Paris, Berlin, New York, all were drowning in their own waste. This filth had consequences. Epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery tore through cities, killing thousands. At the time, doctors still clung to the miasma theory. They believed these diseases were caused by bad air, not germs. The idea of invisible microorganisms was ridiculed. That is, until one man changed everything. Enter Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician working in a Vienna hospital. In the 1840s, he noticed something strange. Women who gave birth in the hospital's doctor-run maternity ward died far more often from childbed fever than those in the midwife-run ward. After investigating, Semmelweis made a revolutionary discovery. Doctors were performing autopsies in the morning, then delivering babies without washing their hands. The solution? Wash hands with chlorinated lime. Mortality rates plummeted. But his colleagues were furious. They mocked him, resisted the change, and eventually forced him out. Semmelweis died in an asylum, and hand washing, ironically, took years to catch on. Meanwhile, another figure emerged, Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, she emphasized cleanliness, fresh air, and proper drainage in military hospitals. Death rates dropped dramatically, and Nightingale began to spread the gospel of hygiene across Britain. Still, it wasn't until the discoveries of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch that the germ theory of disease became widely accepted. They proved that bacteria, not bad smells, caused illness. Pasteur's work on pasteurization, vaccination, and microbial life laid the scientific foundation. Koch isolated the bacteria responsible for anthrax, cholera, and tuberculosis. Suddenly, cleanliness had a face. It was science. Soap became a weapon against death. Soap production exploded. Factories churned out bars for every household. Public health campaigns urged people to wash their hands, bodies, and homes. Hygiene became a national mission. In schools, children were taught not just arithmetic and spelling, but how to bathe properly. Public bathhouses were built in poor neighborhoods. Cities installed underground sewage systems. Street sweepers became common sights. The stench of the past began to lift, but not everything was pure. Just like in the previous century, cleanliness was now weaponized as a form of moral judgment. To be clean was to be civilized. To be dirty was to be backward. Colonial powers used this ideology to justify imperial domination. The British claimed they were bringing sanitation and civilization to India and Africa. In truth, they imposed foreign standards while ignoring native hygiene systems that had existed for centuries. Advertising joined the crusade. Companies like Pears Soap and Lever Brothers launched massive marketing campaigns, portraying soap as the key to moral and social superiority. Posters showed dark-skinned savages being cleansed by white hands. Hygiene became racism's silent ally, and women, again, were at the center of it all. Housewives were held responsible for their family's health. A clean home became a mark of a good mother, a good wife, a good citizen. Failure to maintain hygiene was seen not just as laziness, but as failure of character. In some places, this obsession turned into paranoia. In Victorian England and America, manuals warned mothers that dirt could lead to sin. Little boys who didn't wash might become delinquents. Girls who didn't scrub might lose their virtue. Soap was no longer just soap, it was a moral compass. And yet, despite all the pressure and propaganda, People were finally beginning to bathe regularly. Hot water became more available, especially with the invention of gas water heaters. Bathrooms moved from outdoor sheds to inside the home. A daily wash, or at least a weekly one, became normal. For the first time in centuries, bathing was no longer dangerous. It was desirable. By the early 20th century, most Western societies had accepted that bathing was beneficial, even essential, for health. Hot water plumbing was more accessible, especially in cities. The bathroom had become a permanent part of the modern home. For many, it was a sacred space, tiled, polished, and stocked with sweet-smelling soaps, powders, and lotions. Bathing wasn't just a habit now. It was an expectation. But like every social shift, this came with its own forms of pressure. As industries grew, so did marketing, and the human body became a battlefield for consumerism. Soap was no longer just soap. It was rebranded as self-respect, good manners, and even national duty. One of the clearest examples: the rise of body odor as a marketing invention. In the 1910s and 1920s, deodorants and antiperspirants entered the market, but nobody wanted to talk about armpits publicly. That changed when advertisers realized they could create a problem, then sell the cure. Magazines ran ads warning women that they might be socially rejected if they didn't smell fresh. The unspoken terror was this: you might not know you're offending others. Soon, men were targeted too. A clean-shaven face, a crisp collar, and deodorized underarms became the hallmarks of a modern man. Cleanliness had become performative, something you practiced not for health, but for acceptance. And so began the era of compulsory cleanliness. Schools instituted hygiene checks. Some even measured children's fingernails and ears. Immigrants arriving in America were often sprayed with chemical disinfectants, based on the assumption that they carried old-world diseases. Hygiene was now tied to nationalism, to assimilation, to social worth. During wartime, the propaganda sharpened even further. In World War I and II, soldiers were instructed to bathe whenever possible. Dirty uniforms and unwashed feet led to trench foot and infections. But beyond the physical need, hygiene became a symbol of discipline. A clean soldier was a loyal soldier. A dirty one, possibly a coward, or worse, a dissenter. The Nazi regime in Germany took this to horrifying extremes. They promoted public health as a racial duty. Cleanliness became part of eugenics ideology. Showers were mandatory in schools and labor camps, but in the death camps, of course, the idea of showering took on its most horrific and ironic meaning. Victims were told they would bathe, but were instead led to gas chambers. Hygiene had become a mask for atrocity. Meanwhile, in the post-war West, the obsession continued, but with a more cheerful tone. America entered the age of television. Ads showed smiling children splashing in bathtubs, wives scrubbing porcelain sinks until they gleamed. Hygiene became a suburban virtue. A spotless bathroom was a sign of success, patriotism, and good parenting. But this ideal came at a cost. Poor communities, particularly communities of color, were often blamed for unsanitary conditions, without acknowledging the systemic lack of access to water, plumbing, and healthcare. In rural areas or segregated neighborhoods, clean living was an impossible dream. Yet the shame persisted. People were taught that to be dirty was not just unhealthy, it was immoral. By the 1960s and 70s, this shame sparked a counter-movement. The hippies rejected the soap-slick ideals of their parents. They let their hair grow, wore natural fibers, and often refused to use deodorant. For them, cleanliness was artificial. Bathing too often stripped away natural oils. Smelling like a human was an act of rebellion. But the mainstream quickly fought back. Media painted these non-bathers as lazy, unkempt, even dangerous. The war over bathing had become cultural. And yet, Science was also evolving. Studies began showing that excessive hygiene might not be so healthy after all. Overuse of antibacterial products could weaken the immune system. Children raised in overly sterile environments were more likely to develop allergies and autoimmune disorders, a concept now known as the hygiene hypothesis. In other words, being too clean might be making us sicker. By the late 20th century, some people had come full circle. Biohackers and wellness influencers began promoting alternative bathing routines, once a week. Or even just with water. No soap. Some dermatologists supported it, noting that many soaps disrupt the skin's microbiome. Once again, questions about the necessity of daily bathing were back on the table. It was almost medieval, but with data. By the 21st century, bathing was no longer just about getting clean. It had evolved into a personal ritual, one laden with meaning, identity, and even politics. There were bubble baths for self-care, shower bombs for stress relief, minimalist routines championed by skincare influencers, and 14-step bathing processes recommended by beauty gurus on YouTube. People no longer just bathed to wash away the dirt of the day, they bathed to feel something: peace, joy, control. For many, the bathroom had become a sanctuary. Hot water was no longer a luxury but an expected right in developed countries. We installed dimmable lights, waterproof speakers, eucalyptus bundles, and lavender-infused soaps. Shower time was me time. But while some found serenity, others faced anxiety, because in a hyperconnected world, even cleanliness could trigger competition. People posted shower selfies on Instagram. They filmed morning routines featuring $300 serums. Cleanliness became a brand. And once again, like in the 1920s, the fear of being not clean enough returned, only now. It wore the mask of aesthetics. At the same time, something strange happened. A growing number of people stopped bathing, not completely, but deliberately. Reddit forums and online communities began buzzing with confessions: "I haven't used soap in 2 years. I only shower once a week. And I've never felt better." Some cited science about the skin microbiome and the harm of overwashing. Others simply said, "It saves time. I don't stink. Why bother?" Celebrities chimed in too. Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis famously admitted they rarely bathed their children, and only used water themselves when truly dirty. Jake Gyllenhaal confessed he didn't find bathing necessary. The public was divided. Some were horrified. Others liberated. This led to an ironic twist in history. 1,000 years after people were shamed for bathing, some were now being shamed for not bathing. But unlike the rigid medieval church or the nationalist pressures of the 20th century, today's world is chaotic, fragmented. There's no single standard of cleanliness anymore. In some circles, daily bathing is still a must, especially in high-pressure jobs, hot climates, or densely populated cities. In others, minimalism reigns. Among environmentalists, less bathing is an ecological choice. For busy parents or neurodivergent people, skipping showers is about survival and energy management. Bathing has become deeply personal, and with climate change, the question of water use looms large. How long can we justify 30-minute hot showers when reservoirs dry up and droughts intensify? There is also, perhaps, a hidden longing beneath it all, a wish to reconnect with the body, not as something to be constantly scrubbed, polished, or masked, but as something natural, something human. The same way medieval monks thought bathing weakened the soul. Perhaps now we fear that constant hygiene separates us from nature, from ourselves. Or maybe, just maybe, we're still trying to figure out what it means to be clean, because in the end, clean isn't a universal truth. It's a story, one that changes with time, with power, with belief. So, here we are, from Roman spas to medieval filth, from Victorian shame to Instagram glamour. And back again to I don't use soap anymore. The story of bathing has never really been about cleanliness. It's been about power. About belief. About how we view the body, sacred or sinful. Natural or in need of control. We bathe to fit in. To stand out. To feel whole. Or sometimes, to feel nothing at all. And in the echo of cold cathedral stones or the hiss of a hot shower, we're reminded, cleanliness is never just skin deep. It's a mirror, one that reflects not only our dirt, but our fears, our vanity, our longing to be accepted, to be good, to be pure. Maybe that's why we're still arguing over how often to wash our armpits in the 21st century. Because being clean isn't just a routine, it's a ritual. And like all rituals, it says more about us than we'd like to admit. Sleep well, historians.